Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. As you've just heard, the agency, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, is an Australian government statutory body. And in fact, there's a bit of a misconception. We've been around a long time, been around for about 28 years. The agency started off as the Affirmative Action Agency and then sometime later became the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Agency, and then in December 2012 became the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Certainly our primary statutory mandate is to promote and improve gender equality in Australian workplaces, and we have a range of functions to enable us to do this. So we have an educative function, for example. We're here to explain to people the value of gender diversity in workplaces and give organisations practical tools to help them improve their gender performance. We also have an obligation to promote public debate in this area and influence change. So we put a lot of resource into our influencing agenda and into our education agenda. But importantly, we are also a regulator. We are what we like to describe as a light touch regulator. We're very focused on making sure organisations improve in this space. We really don't have much interest in seeing organisations non-compliant. We work very cooperatively with organisations to get them over that compliance line. So in our regulatory role, organisations in the private sector with 100 or more employees are required to report to us annually on their gender performance. And very importantly, this year, commencing on the 1st of April this year, that reporting changes. So previously organisations have reported on what I might describe as inputs. They reported on the programs they had to improve gender equality in their workplaces. But from 1st April, organisations will now report on outputs. So the outputs they report on will be in relation to things described in our legislation as gender equality indicators. Now there are 6 categories of gender equality indicators. So there's gender composition of your workforce, gender composition of your board, equal pay, flexible work and other conditions to support families and caring responsibilities. There's consultation within your workforce on gender equality, and the final category is sex-based discrimination and harassment. So importantly, organisations will report to us against those very specific categories, and we will have very, very valuable output data. And the real engine room of the legislation is the standardised nature of this data. We'll have specific, standardised, relevant data, which is very broad-based, covering organisations, I say, with 100 or more employees. So the value of the data is unquestionable. We will have an unprecedented picture of what gender equality looks like in Australian workplaces. And the data is in fact world-leading. No data of this nature is available in any other country. So it's a very powerful tool, we believe, to move the needle in a space where, regrettably, we seem to, in some respects, going backwards. So the question is, what will we do with that data? And, you know, we have a philosophy in the agency. If we're asking organisations to provide us with data, and of course they're compelled to do so if they're in the private sector, we must return value commensurate with the effort organisations put in to report that data to us. So for individual reporting organisations, we will give to each of those organisations a confidential, customised benchmark report against those gender equality indicators. So those organisations will be able to see very clearly how they're travelling, where they're doing well, when they're not doing so well and might need to focus their effort. They can see how they compare to their competitors, and of course they can track their progress over time. But for the broader public at large, and that of course includes the investment community, includes superannuation investors, we will aggregate all that data and we'll put it on our website, on our interactive data centre. And that is data that you will be able to interrogate. Whether you want to look at it by industry sector or by organisational size, you'll be able to see the performance of organisations across the Australian workforce. You'll have the public reports that organisations lodge with us, and of course those reports, once cleared by us, will be made public on our website once the remuneration data is excluded, and then you'll have the benchmark material. So you'll be able to see very clearly who are the leaders in this space, who are the laggards in this space. And we're looking to the investment community to use this new tool, this new standardised data, to inform their discussions inform their discussions with investment targets, with service providers, to make better decisions. For the first time, comparison and analysis in this area will be a lot easier than it's ever been. So we believe the power of the investment community to help us drive change is very clear. We look to the investment community to help us keep gender on the agenda. Thanks very much.
Well, first and foremost, I wanted to begin by just simply stating that AXI, while the issue of, gender diversity across boards is a broad one with many facets, but primarily AXI sees this as a financial issue for investors. Now, AXI's work engaging with listed boards is really, I think, focused on that key contention that better skilled and more diverse boards will actually drive better investment outcomes for the funds in this room. Now, we know that diversity can be measured across a number of axes, so age, experience, skill, geographical, various backgrounds are all factors which come into the discussion, but gender is probably one of the most critical elements given the talent pool in both executive and non-executive ranks in this country. Now, in a very qualitative sense, this issue was put to me quite recently actually by an ASX 50 chair who talked about the stupidity curve. And the thesis there was really, if we're taking a broad population across the market and trying to find the most talented and the most skilled people to be appointed to our leading boards, if we're ignoring half of the population within that appointment process, we're actually very quickly climbing that stupidity curve in terms of finding the best and smartest people. And I thought that's a useful, very useful way of capturing that qualitative factor. And perhaps Sam can use that in our question time and ignore questions on this half of the room. Because we know these people are probably more skilled and talented, and we know them very well, but we'll ignore this side. But I guess putting that aside, we know that, I think, from discussions and engagement from both leading and laggard boards in the top 200 companies, that there are a range of qualitative elements, and particularly from leading boards, things like better decision making, better talent retention in senior management, and the avoidance of that term, which is often used, of groupthink. So having a diverse range of people at the board level. Many ASX 50 and 100 chairs actually see that as a real value driver at the board level. And I think now that there's all of those qualitative elements, but also a growing body of quantitative research and data, which shows that these programs are critical for the funds in this room. So I've seen a whole range of investor research. McKinsey did a survey of S&P 500 companies in the US, which actually showed that companies with better gender participation at the board level, as well as senior management, actually outperformed both in terms of financial performance as well as a range of organisational metrics. Credit Suisse actually did a similar but a global study with over 2,300 companies involved. And what they actually found was that over a 6-year period, companies with better gender diversity on their boards outperformed, and around a whole range of metrics. So on average, there was a higher return on equity, lower gearing, actually greater growth during the period. So it's an interesting, they weren't claiming causation in that discussion, but it was a very interesting correlation which they pointed to. And I think it's one area where we see that reporting is critical. So Helen's given the overview of what will be available from the agency, and that's the really rich insight which investors need. We've seen it also from the ASX Corporate Governance Council, where AXI has been part of that dialogue, where moving from the discussion of policy to actual outputs and how organisations set targets, how they track against those targets, and how they see the business case around gender diversity developing. And they're very rich tools for investors. On the issue of engagement, I think the past 4 years has really been a watershed, both I think with inside the boardroom and Elizabeth will share, I think, some of those insights. But from us, in terms of the investor perspective, we've really seen 2008 as a major turning point, because at that period, and ACSI's data actually showed this, that in top 200 companies, we're around about the 10% mark in terms of participation of women on top 200 boards. But that number of 10% was actually going backwards at that time. So, we saw the real need for intervention and to change that dialogue. And that's something we've seen in spades. So both dealing with, broader bodies like the Women on Boards Association, the AICD, as well as individual companies, we've seen that discussion change. And actually, since 2008, there's been a doubling of the number of women on ASX 200 boards. So there are now very strong, results on the board. But, as we know that, the numbers can double, but we're still only 18% in top 200 companies, so there's clearly a way to go in that discussion. There are a whole range of angles to look at and a whole lot of data available, but one of those elements that we've picked up from a number of the companies we've engaged with is that the issue of gender diversity is actually linked to a broader discussion among top companies around getting the most skilled and talented and professional boards, that the two are particularly linked. And if you ask people who have been on boards for 10, 15 or even 5 years, they'll say that boards today in the Australian market are more professional, and part of the discussion around getting more diverse candidates has actually been increasing the pool of directors beyond the usual suspects, and we've seen that as a really positive development which ACSI is keen to build on.
Okay. Thank you. It's good to be here to talk about this issue. I support both what Helen and Ed have said, and I'll build on that and focus specifically on my experience as a director. Ed referred to a McKinsey report. If I build on that with the research by Catalyst, by Deloitte, and also by the Ryby Institute of Australia, there's, I think, pretty compelling evidence that workplace diversity, and diversity here in all its senses, not just gender, leads to increased results. Ed's talked about ROE, but also greater innovation, increased employee engagement and productivity, as well as commitment to the firm. But boards and senior management need to ensure that to reap the full benefits of that they actually link their diversity efforts and goals to the business strategy. There's sometimes a danger that this looks like the latest management fad or something that's not connected with the business. And the best companies, I think, link what they're doing in the diversity space with what their goals are. And that includes choosing the best people. I hadn't heard the stupidity curve, but I actually think it's, in the past, less than 50% of the population that's been available for selection to boards, because if you exclude women, and that happened in the past, also people from, for example, different ethnic backgrounds, perhaps people with quite different careers or different modes of thinking, have often been excluded as well. So it may actually be, the maths don't matter, 30 or 40% of the population over a certain age, so again, an even smaller percentage of the population available for selection on boards. And Ed talked about it being a financial issue. I agree. I've always seen this as a business economic issue rather than an equity issue, because my primary responsibility, yours if you're a director, is shareholder value. And to do that, you need the best people you can recruit around the board table. The boards that I'm on and the ones I've served on in the past are increasingly looking to ensure that not only have they got the skills for today, but looking to say, what will our company be like? What will the community be like? What will the customer demands be over whatever time horizon you look at? And asking, what are the skills and experiences and backgrounds that we need to take this company, this organisation forward? And I think we've seen some change over the last 5 years. Helen and Ed have referred to the increase in the number of women on boards. And today, in the ASX 100, only 9% of companies don't have a woman on the board. Although when you get down in the ASX 400 to 500, it's 57% with women on board, so 43% without it. There's still a significant way to go, and the way that good boards are thinking about it is a business imperative, an economic imperative, and it is finding the right people. But I'll conclude with a little caution that I have, and it comes from the Norway experience, where the government there mandated that 40% of all Norwegian boards by a few years into the future must have women on their boards. They're at 32, 33% today, so it's almost achieved. But it's been achieved in many cases by moving women too quickly, too soon out of executive roles. And my caution is this, that in some boards I'm in every month, sometimes every other month, I can have a much more limited impact on the culture of the organisation, much more limited than the executives in the organisation. And we need to focus, and the focus has been right, women on boards, but we need to ensure that this is not just happening at the expense of denuding the ranks already fairly thin, at least in our top corporations, of women, because we need to be focusing on women in management roles as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have plenty of time for questions. Is there a question from the audience before we head down to the Twitter questions? No? Let me start with a question from the Twitter sphere. I guess the view from each of our panellists, do you believe quotas are required to achieve gender equality, in the workplace, but particularly on boards? And there's a related question about not just boards, but the C-suite, so to speak. Can we address each of those in terms of your view about enforced quotas?
For a number of years, I started my career back in the early 80s, and I would have, I think, then not expected we'd still be talking about this issue in 2014, that it would have been solved. I came from a position where I didn't think quotas or targets were necessary. All of us wants to believe that we've achieved what we've achieved on our own merits. But I think that it is only quotas, or at least the threat of them, that's at least started this dialogue, whether it's the ASX guidelines and the if not, why not requirement. And I think that a Catalyst study, it's a few years out of date now, but a Catalyst study about 2007 said that at the current rate in Australia of progress of women on boards, it would be 177 years before there would be equality. Now that's speeded up a little, but only a little, and I think that it's targets, quotas, or the threat that's got as much movement as there is.
Okay. Ed?
Well, I think that's actually one area where, again, the late champion of this industry, Michael O'Sullivan, took a very principled approach, because he saw the issue, he saw it from a very long-term perspective, as was his approach to so many issues. And he said, well, we want to go in and advocate and engage for self-adoption as a first preference, but inevitably, if there isn't that improvement, the discussion around quotas has to be there. And I think that really ties into what Elizabeth has said, that it's something we've seen right around the globe. I mean, I guess Norway is a long-standing example, but one of the largest improving economies we've seen recently is France, where there are particular quotas in place and actually fines for companies over, I think, over the size of 50 million euros, where those quotas are effectively in place. And that discussion starts, I think, in any economy where the numbers are going backwards and there's no sense of development. And I think, I mean, without those quotas in Australia, the next 5 years will be critical, because we've seen the number double in absolute terms in top 200 companies. And that took, I think, 25% of new appointments last year in top 200 companies were women. But if it's only 22% next year, and we're sitting at 18, it doesn't take too long to really bottom out and to also see that go backwards. Because that was one factor, and I didn't get to mention it earlier, but in 2008, 2009, when the overall number had dropped below 10%, it was only 5% of new appointments to ASX 200 boards were women. So it was low and going backwards. So the trend is critical, and changing that discussion is critical.
Look, in the agency, we make a very clear distinction between mandatory quotas and voluntary targets. So mandatory quotas are quotas imposed externally to organisations, normally by governments, with some sort of ramifications for non-compliance. Voluntary targets are targets set by individual organisations suitable to their particular circumstances. And we support voluntary targets, not mandatory quotas. And the reason for that is that when we talk to people about targets and those good organisations that are setting voluntary targets, we see they work. Those organisations are the ones that are brought substantively into this issue and are putting in place the infrastructure in their organisations to make change. And it's interesting, the Norway experience shows that where there was a mandatory quota applied to boards, people moved to compliance. But there was no similar increase in the executive ranks where there wasn't the application of mandatory quotas, so people were just ticking the box. So the position we take at the moment is there are some regulatory frameworks within which organisations must operate. So there's the ASX best practice recommendations around corporate governance. Now, of course, that applies just to listed companies, but then, of course, there's also this new reporting framework of those organisations that have to report to our agency. We believe organisations should be given the opportunity to work within those frameworks to see if they can drive change. Now, if there isn't change in the relative short term, you may need some sort of disruptive temporary measure like quotas to try and improve the position. But I have to say, quotas are a very blunt instrument, and they're more easily applied to boards than they are to executive ranks. Boards have got more similar structures company to company, and so if you apply a quota, it's an easier thing to do. The difficulty with executive ranks is that the hierarchies in companies are very differently structured, and it's very hard to, in a mandatory provision, cover all different sorts of scenarios in companies. So at the moment, we're urging organisations to set voluntary targets. And interestingly, organisations have said to us they'd like to do that, but they don't know how to do it. And there's no point setting targets that are impossible to reach, because that then taints the whole issue and people get very turned off from this issue. So we actually developed a target setting tool. So you can go onto our website and there's a free tool that sets up a 7-step process and a calculator where you can put your data in to help you derive realistic, practical targets for your circumstances. And very interestingly, we've had a huge download of that tool. People wanted that practical resource, and we're hoping now that people are downloading it that we're going to see more organisations setting those voluntary targets.
Thanks, Helen. We have a question from the floor, number 2.
Yeah. Thank you. I've been living in Hong Kong for 22 years, and what sort of really surprised me is just the level of senior women working across, particularly the financial services industry. And I think it's because there's just so much more support through having domestic helpers to be able to sort of let both the man and the woman go to work if there's a family. Is that sort of something that you think is symptomatic of why these quotas are necessary? Because it's just there's been usually the woman is the caretaker, and they've been held back in terms of participation in the workforce. And if you did have, say, domestic helpers from, say, Indonesia, that would improve the situation.
Well, I don't know that we want to turn ourselves into a country with low-paid domestic help in the household. I think the biggest problem that women face a number of problems. Biggest problem is access to good quality, affordable childcare, and we don't have it, and the paid parental leave scheme won't give it to us. I have a daughter who has two little children, so I'm reasonably close to the struggle. And I think we as a community have to get serious about childcare. I know in Canada that they have, that it's subsidised, it's affordable, it's high quality, and the increase in women's participation in the workforce has been extraordinary as a result of that. And I think I'd certainly be opposed to any idea that we would import what I suspect would be low-paid women, no doubt, from Indonesia or elsewhere to do that when we should be able to do it ourselves.
Just, I guess, to add a quick, addition to that, that certainly there are a range of macroeconomic issues involved, but the interesting thing, and actually there's some very recent research out of the UK, with KPMG's undertaken a study looking at some of those common issues which are often cited as reasons not, for instance, not to implement particular strategies, and actually more often than not, some of those sort of sacred cows or those, accepted truths were not the case within sort of leading or much larger organisations. And I think that's one thing where some of the policies, I think, reported under the ASX Corporate Governance Council are quite interesting, because, they involve things like flexible work hours, because when we look at top boards, it's not, it's not 100% ex-CEOs of large companies. When we look around the boardroom, I mean, you mentioned skilled, people within financial services. There are a whole range of paths, and those are broadening. So, there are those broader issues which are often, and sometimes, one-to-one discussion with a chair, you see some of those issues or very individual issues trotted out, but actually for each one of those I think there are also sort of policies and programs underway to cut through those at the executive and the board level. So we think that's very important.
Okay, perhaps I'll combine a couple of questions that have come through. There was a question that simply said, how do we stop the recycling of the same women on boards and give others an opportunity? And if I could just labour that question, it seems to imply a lack of supply, right? But yet we know that if you go back to what Mr. Gonski was saying this morning, and that is it's important in boards to have broad experience set. And that goes back to the qualifications of, say, graduates at university, in want of a different pool. But there are equal number of women coming out of university across all fields, right? I mean, there might be some field specifics, but let's take that as a principle, that it's not the supply that's the problem at that level. And these, and as a cohort, they go into business. And so I'm wondering whether the question really asks, is there a lack of supply, or is the answer as simple as it's the old boys network?
It's probably a bit of both. I think that some search firms are not great at finding different people, and here I'm not just talking gender, and not all boards use search anyway. I mean, it isn't, if you're aspiring to be on a board, it isn't just enough to send your CV to a few headhunters and hope for the best. A lot of this comes from networking, but a lot of it is, as David Gonski said, what is your background and what do you bring to a board? So there's the supply side, but there's also the putting yourself if you can, in the shoes of the chairman or the other directors and asking what is it that they might be looking for. I mean, to take an extreme example, I was asked by a very bright 28-year-old young woman at an event I spoke at not so long ago, do you know any boards who would want a very bright and energetic 28-year-old mother of two? To which I said, not trying to be flippant, the school council, some arts boards, and she actually meant a listed company. I don't want to be ageist, but what boards look for is experience and skills, and you're unlikely at 28 or perhaps even 38 to have that. And I think what David Gonski was referring to is, the broad range of skills and experiences that you're able to bring in conjunction with the rest of your board to bring to bear to take the company or the organisation forward. I think what we've got is probably a mismatch between lots of people's aspirations to be on boards. The Old Boys Club sure still operates, but also the sometimes lack of being realistic about what else it is you need to do to get you ready to be on a board. And that doesn't just mean another experience or the like, but it can also mean networking and making sure that you're aware of the people, headhunters and others, who are in this space.
Look, I agree with that, Elizabeth, but I do think there's a reluctance for many boards to take a little bit of a risk. Yes. We really have a problem in getting women, highly qualified women, noticed. There's no doubt about that. I mean, women are highly qualified in this country. We rate on international indices #1 for educational attainment. We have highly experienced women across the industry sectors in this country. But the difficulty is getting women surfaced and noticed. But when they are, and I have to say I think some of the search firms are a little lazy, given many calls I get from search firms who want me to do the research for them. Can you tell me I've got this assignment? Can you give me some names? I feel like saying, I think you should be out there doing your job a little differently. But once you can identify these women, then I think there's an innate conservatism in the boardroom, which I have personally witnessed, where people who obviously they must work as a team, as David Gonski was saying, so they're concerned about who might be joining the team and whether they're going to fit in. So they naturally revert to a conservative position and are more inclined still to appoint people they know or people who look like them. And so that affects all diversity, not just gender diversity, but other aspects of diversity. So, I would be urging boards to perhaps take a little more risk in appointing people. And, I've heard directors say that where they have taken those risks, they've been calculated risks, they haven't regretted it.
I guess just to add to that, we see a huge element of risk with staying the path of conservatism. If you are looking for those differing views, or for the new batch of directors to again stay with the tried and true or accepted directors, carries its own risk. But just going back to the, I think, first question though about the sort of usual suspects, or I think that they mentioned sort of recycled directors. One thing we found, so every year between 2005 to 2008, on top 100 boards, the majority of new appointments actually came from other top 100 boards. So with this dwindling number, and again, we saw gender diversity dropping over that time, but with this dwindling number, there was a very insular discussion going on. So there's obviously the questions around supply, and particularly within executive ranks, but often it's actually the demand side where the issue sits, because again, search firms are only as good as the brief that they get from listed boards. And what we see now from boards who have championed these sorts of issues is, tearing up lists or throwing them back to the firms to actually get new names where they're seeing the usual suspects, to try and change that conversation. So it certainly was, I think, a very insular discussion. And I think when the first advocacy was happening around better gender diversity on top 200 boards, people did look to Catherine Livingstone or Belinda Hutchinson or any one of a number of fantastically qualified existing members of top 50 and top 100 boards, and their message was often, why aren't you looking more broadly? So I think we need to learn from those sorts of lessons to change that dialogue.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the feed. I'll direct this one to Helen if I can, and perhaps Elizabeth may want to respond. It's a practical question about the agency and the data that it will collect. So practically, Helen, how do you envisage entities leveraging off the data that you collect to affect change?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, individual organisations who report to us will have customised confidential benchmark reports. So they'll have the best data they have ever had. They'll have the evidence base for the first time to pinpoint their efforts. And we're realistic. We know that, organisations are busy. They have a lot of things they have to do. They've got a limited amount of resource they can apply to this issue. So they will now have that evidence base to enable them to target their efforts, their resources where they need to most. But I think the biggest power, and this is where the investor community comes in, is in the aggregated data. So it's our obligation to make sure that that data is very accessible to the public at large. And as I indicated earlier, we'll have the data available on our interactive data centre on our website. But you've got to then persuade the investment community that gender matters. And we're realistic. If you look at the superannuation industry, there's a primary responsibility to preserve and grow the retirement savings of those that you're responsible for. So the financial criteria are obviously paramount in the management of your investments. But the reality is that if companies are well managed, they're managing diversity well. If they're not managing diversity well, that is indicative of poor management in companies. So it really, I think, behoves big asset owners, big investors to look very closely at how organisations are managing diversity. And I'm realistic enough to know that, in investment mandates and the like, there may not be very specific KPIs around gender performance. But we are looking to the investment community to make sure this discussion is had. Gender needs to be discussed. It's part of your ESG, your corporate social responsibility discussions. So at the very least, these discussions should be had, and management should be pressed to explain how they're managing their diversity within their organisations. Now, the extent to which it then impacts decisions about where money is invested is a different issue and perhaps a more complex issue. But we want to now say to people, you have the data, you can actually see an individual organisation's report to the agency, and you can look at the aggregated data and see how they rate within their industry. You should be asking them questions about their performance where their performance is below par on their industry basis.
All right, thank you. Well, look, it appears that the legislation has been suitably strengthened to permit you to collect that data, and the onus is then left on the users of that data, whether they are investors or otherwise, to draw conclusions and to take appropriate action. But if failing that, do you envisage a name and shame outcome at any point in time?
Well, look, we can name and shame at the moment. That's a provision in the legislation, and some people celebrate being named and shamed, I have to say. They love it. But look, there aren't great sanctions for non-compliance, and really what we're trying to do is persuade people that there is a huge benefit here. And I should say there has been some question mark about reporting to the agency. There's been a lot of media about it over the last couple of months. And the suggestion was, well, first of all, the suggestion was that we were going to be abolished. So the government's come out and said they're not abolishing us, unlike the ACNC, regrettably for them. So we will continue. There was then some suggestion that the number of matters to be reported to us would be reduced. Now, as of last week, the government's indicated that's not the case. at least pro tem. There is a consultation that the government's conducted with business in relation to this, and some of that consultation will continue. But certainly the reporting as currently framed in the legislation will be embedded in that way for at least 2 years. And if the government's feedback is that the reporting or aspects of the reporting aren't useful to organisations, they may adjust that. And I do have to say to you that in the agency we believe there are a couple of reporting matters that we don't think will return sufficient value to reporting organisations to justify the effort in reporting on them. So we've conducted our own consultation and we'll be working with the government to try and eliminate those matters, because we simply want organisations to report to us data that's valuable for them and for the public at large, so that the effort they put in giving us that data is commensurate with the value that they get back and that the community at large gets back.
All right, thank you very much. Could we just join hands to thank our panellists today?